Hi there, this is Logan Fairbairn. I'm the developer of Matlay, a Blender add-on that makes the material editing workflow faster and easier for complex materials in Blender. In this video, I'll be covering the installation of Matlay and the basic workflow for editing materials with it. We'll start off by downloading Matlay from the GitHub page. You can get the latest version from the Releases tab. You can also get a development version from the green code button and just downloading zip when you're on the main branch. The development version will have additional features and bug fixes, but is likely going to be less stable than using one of the releases. So we'll click on the release tab. And I'm going to just download this zip file here. And there we go. So now we've got the add-on on our computer. And you'll want to move this to a folder where you store Blender add-ons. I'm going to install this by installing it like any other add-on is installed. So we go to Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, Install, locate your zip file that you downloaded, and click Install Add-on, and then just enable it by clicking the checkbox there. All right, so now that we have Matlay installed, we'll be moving on to testing some of the textures with it. To test the material editing, I'm going to be testing on a monkey object. So I'm going to just delete this cube. I'm going to add a new mesh, and I'm going to add a monkey. I'm also going to make this monkey look a little bit better by adding a subdivision surface modifier, bumping it up. I'm going to apply it by hovering my cursor over the subdivision modifier and applying it with Control A. And I'm going to tab into edit mode, and I'm going to smooth the shading of these normals. So smooth faces. So now the mesh looks a little bit better. Now this is a object created using like a standard object in Blender. So I know that the UVs for this object are correct, but if you're editing custom objects like you likely will be, if you go into the UV editing tab, you should double check your UVs are properly laid out and unwrapped, and there's no overlays or overlapping, pinched UVs. You want to make sure that your stuff is properly unwrapped because the add-on expects that your objects are properly unwrapped before you start using it. Now that that's taken care of, let's move on. If I push N when my cursor's over the 3D viewport, I can open up the side panel, select Matlay, and then I will just open this window up a little bit so you can see this text. And it says that I need to save the blend file. And the reason I need to save it is because textures, big mesh maps, and exported textures are all saved relative to the blend file's path location. So it kind of tries to manage saving and exporting textures for you automatically. And that's why it needs you to sort of identify someplace on your computer where to save these files. So I'm going to save this to my desktop. I'm going to create a new blend file and just save that as test.blend. And to reload this interface, to get it to refresh, I'll just click on one of the objects. Now that the interface is in there, you'll note that with this interface, it's kind of got like this really big dual column layout, and there's kind of like a lot of space here. It's kind of cramped, right? So you'll actually want to use the suggested workspace. So if you go to the utils panel and you append the workspace here, you'll load the suggested workspace for editing with this add-on. You can see your object there, and you've got your image editor on the side here, and you have a lot more space over here so you can sort of pan around. It's also maybe important to note that you can also hit Control Space when your cursor is over any interface section in Blender to make it go full screen. So if I push Control Space now, when my cursor is over this 3D viewport, it'll give me a bigger window so it's a little bit easier to see the full object and see the texture. And just control space or the back to previous button to get out of this. And it works in every window. So if I do it in this one as well, I can see like a full texture window and so on and so forth. It's just pretty handy to know that, so that way you can edit these textures efficiently. All right, so let's start actually making some materials. First, you'll want to define which textures you're going to want to create as part of your texture set that you're creating for your materials. So materials are made up of sort of multiple textures that include information about what material channels contain. So you got color, metallic, roughness, normal on by default, but there's a bunch of other channels that you could use as well. The standard setup is pretty good for the majority of objects, but you may want to use like subsurface or emission for glow or specular in some cases. So it's up to you if you want to toggle these on. You just click them to toggle them on and click them to toggle them off. If you want to only work in the color channel, so you're maybe doing a hand painted thing, you can actually toggle all these off except for the color, and that's also pretty useful as well. Lastly, you also want to define the texture size. This is the size of all textures that will be created for your materials. Using this add-on, they will all be created at this particular texture resolution, right? So you'll want this to sort of be your desired texture size. You don't really want to change this once you start editing, otherwise you may have pixel differences between previously created layers and new images that were created later on. You might have like some weird pixel distortion as a result of that, so you want to leave this at a consistent size in the texture set. All right, so let's go on to the baking tab. So the baking tab is intended to allow you to bake mesh maps for your object very quickly. So if you're not familiar with a mesh map, what it is it's data that's sort of extracted from the geometry of your model to a texture format. And it can be used in the material editing workflow to apply materials to your object quickly. So just as an example of this, the ambient occlusion, which is the mesh map that contains sort of the dark crevices of your object, that could be used to apply dirt in the crevices automatically, rather than having to manually place dirt in all the crevices by painting it on. So it's a quick way to apply materials to your object when you compare it to the alternative of just manually painting it on. The default settings are usually pretty good for baking. However, you do want to make sure that you're using your GPU if you have one. So if you have a GPU, set your GPU by selecting this button here, clicking GPU compute. You'll also want to make sure that you have your GPU enabled in the preferences for Blender, so that way it's able to utilize your GPU. So go to Edit Preferences, System, and I suggest using CUDA if you have this available, and make sure that your graphics card is selected. If it's not selected, or CUDA isn't available, just use one of the other ones if you have that available. If you do not have a graphics card and you try baking some of this, it may be extremely slow. So just as a test, I'm going to actually reduce this to 1024, and I'm going to select the object, and I'm going to click Batch Bake. So I'll just bake with the default settings. And while this bakes, I'm going to go to the desktop, which is where I've saved it, and I already have a folder called Matlay, which is created. Mesh Maps is created in here, and then in the Mesh Maps folder, if I just wait a moment, you'll actually see the images that are being baked will be saved here. Do note that I don't have a loading bar, so after you click Batch Bake, just let Blender sit there and chug along until you get these out. And you can check the Mesh Maps folder to see the progress of them loading into Blender. All right, so that's the start of this tutorial, and I'm going to rebake these mesh maps at a slightly higher resolution, and then I'll be right back. All right, so these are now rendered at a slightly higher resolution. They're a little bit more crisp. And one more thing before we move on is after you've baked mesh maps, you should see that they're baked in the baking tab here, where it will say the name of the object and then the name of the mesh map. So these look pretty good. Time to move on to the next section. So this is the section where you will add, edit, move around, and layer materials. This is the real bread and butter of the add-on. Let's start off by clicking the object to make sure it's selected, and then I will add a new layer. I'm going to add fill, and it should create a material with the name of the object and a material layer as well. And these material layers are, as I was saying, they're full materials, right? So you can't really think of this like Photoshop in the same way. These are full materials rather than just an image like Photoshop. It's a material that has a whole bunch of properties. You can see the properties for your material in Edit Material and Material. So these two tabs. And then you can see the properties here. So if you change some of these, change the color, make it metallic, make it a little bit less rough, you get some shiny materials, right? And these properties are based off of the properties of the texture set that you've defined in the texture set tab. So if I turn on height here, I go back to the layers, you'll notice that I now have a height property as well, right? So if I turn this back off, go back to the layers tab, height is no longer here because we're not intending to use the height material channel. These material channels are represented by nodes. So the color material channel is represented by color node, but I can change it by clicking on it and changing the type. So if I change it to a texture, and then I import a texture, let's look on my computer to find, let's grab it from here. So if I import this color texture into the color material channel, I'll just make it not metallic. Now I've got this ground sort of texture in here. And when you're importing textures, you really want these to be full materials, right? So you actually want to have a texture for each material channel generally. And you can find these online for free. There's websites like AmbientCG, TextureCAN, and Polyhaven all have these materials that you can download. And you get a texture set for that material, which is free. And in these cases, these are actually in public domain, so they're usable commercially. There's plenty of other websites that you can find as well. So if you download a full texture set, you can actually import it using this utility function here. So if I click Import Texture Set, and then I pick out some texture set here. Let's say I'll pick this rock, and I'm selecting all the textures that are in the texture set. If I was to import this, what it should do is it should look at the name of the texture and import the textures into the correct material channel based off of the name and identifiers that are in the name to identify that this texture color is going into the color channel. This texture here, normal, is going into the normal channel. So this does require your textures to be named with some identifier in the texture name. Most texture names and formats should work. If they don't, then just import them manually. But if they don't, then it likely means that you should rename the textures. That way they have a good naming convention. They correctly identify which textures are supposed to go into which material channel. All right, so if I click Import Texture Set, it should automatically put the color in the right spot, the roughness in the right spot, and the normal. And now I have a rock texture, a rock material. All right, so I've imported this material, and right away there's kind of like a bit of an issue where this material has a seam running down the middle of the head. And this is because the projection by default for layers is UV projection or a flat projection. So if I go to the projection tab, you can see the projection settings, and these are the projection settings for this layer. If I change the mode from flat to triplanar, now I get this no more seams. And this is because rather than using the UVs to project the object, it's actually projecting the object from all different directions onto the object. And it's doing that for all of the material channels that are using a image texture. I've got a little GIF here that kind of showcases this a little bit better. So it projects the X, projects the Y, and projects the Z. And you can also kind of see this if you were to rotate it as well. So I go to the projection and I change the rotation on one of these axes. So I change the X-axis. You can kind of see any part of the object which is in the sort of X direction will have its texture rotated, and the same thing with Z and Y. And you'll notice it's all being blended together. It's being blended based on this amount. So less blending value is actually blending it a little bit more. So this is sort of like the hardness of how it blends together. I'm going to just set these back to default because I don't think we actually need to really adjust these, at least particularly for this texture, right? All right, so now that we have this texture in here, I'm going to just name this rock. So that will be our first material. But these aren't, this isn't terribly useful. It's kind of nice to have the triplanar projection. But what is more useful is actually being able to mix multiple materials together. So if I add a new layer, I now have a new material on top of the first one. And this material is overriding all of the material channels of the previous layer. If I want it to, I can override only some of the material channels. So like for instance, if I turn off this color for this layer, it will actually only, it'll show the color channel from the rock below it, but it's overriding the metallic roughness and normal, which is why you don't get that kind of those cracks from the previous layer. So if I turn off normal as well, you'll now see the normal material channel from the previous layer being shown through because this one is not using its normal channel, right? You can also hide these by toggling the layer on and off using the little eye if you need to hide them. Let's import a new texture set for this material. So I will import this gold, and now we have gold, and again it's got the same issue where it's got this annoying UV seam. So I'm going to just change this projection to triplanar, and boom, no more seam. Okay, so now we will want to name this. That's important. And I kind of want to mix this with the previous layer. So to mix this, we will mix it in an efficient way using a mask here. So we go to Edit Mask, and I add a new mask. There's a bunch of different types to choose from. I'm going to just do an empty mask first. And I could import a mask texture here, but I'm going to actually just use the roughness, even though it's technically incorrect to do this, but I'm going to use the roughness of the rock material channel, of the rock material that's on the original layer. And you can see this, it is blending, but it's kind of like hard to tell because the roughness is kind of very low contrast of the previous layer. So we can actually adjust this by going to the mask filters. So each mask that you apply actually has its own filters. And I'm going to add a value to RGB. So this is like a levels filter. And now I can adjust the contrast of this mask. So I bring up these levels. You can see that I'm actually adjusting this. I can just invert it to something that I kind of like. It's pretty good. Maybe a little bit less. Yeah, so that looks pretty cool, I think. And it may be kind of tricky to see, but this is actually suffering from the same issue as the previous layers where it's got this UV seam down the middle. And this is because the mask is actually using the UV flat projection. I want it to use the triplanar as well. So swap that to triplanar, and that should be fixed and no more seam. All right, so that's looking pretty cool. Now I kind of want these eyes to be like pure gold, just for coolness factor. All right, so to make these eyes look gold, we'll just add a new fill layer. And I'm going to just re-import this gold texture set. So now I have another layer, another material layer of gold. In this case, I don't think I need to set this to triplanar. So I'll leave the projection settings because we're only doing these eyes here. I'm going to just add a mask here. In this case, I'm going to add a black mask instead of a empty mask. And the only real difference between those is that when you create a new black mask, you're creating a texture that comes along with the mask as well, and it's completely black, right? It'll select it for you automatically. So if I go to edit mode and I select these eyes by pointing my cursor at them and hitting L to, oops, let's deselect first, and then let's point your cursor at it and select these with L for select linked. And then I'm going to go to texture paint mode. I'm going to select the fill bucket, turn on the paint masking, and make sure I'm selecting white because we want the mask to mask using white. So if I click onto these eyes here, see that the mask area where the eyes are on the UVs has been painted white, and now I'm properly masking out this second gold layer for just the eyes. I'm also going to show that you can paint materials onto your object. So this is just a image mask that we're using. And if I go back to the texture paint mode, disable this paint masking, select a brush, I should be able to just paint directly into this mask. And you can get some pretty cool results using this. You know, if you were to use this add-on strictly for, you know, just managing layers that you wanted to paint, it would actually be pretty useful for that as well. So I'm going to just add a little bit of paint here just to show that this is possible. I'm going to make it look like he's kind of, you know, crying gold or something, because that's a pretty cool look, I think. All right. All right. So that's looking pretty good. I won't go too overboard with painting in the tutorial. So next up is we're going to just take a look at using the baked mesh maps to apply some additional flare. So I've got this kind of like rocky gold texture. If I make a new fill layer, and then I'm going to import a texture set, and let's say I'm going to do this this sort of ground dirt. I'm going to import this. So now this is completely using this ground material. And just name this layer ground. And just like before, we will add a new mask. I'm going to add an empty mask, and I'm going to use the ambient occlusion that we had baked earlier. So in this case, it's Suzanne AO. So that's the texture. And it looks like it is actually blending some of the dirt already, but it's very faint. So again, we need to add a new mask filter, add a levels, and I'm going to just invert these bars here. And now you can see in the areas where it's kind of like in a crevice, the dirt is now applied. So this is like a really quick way of using these mesh maps to apply materials to specific parts of your object. And I could have gone on and painted all this in, but you saw that this is like way faster to use this mesh map that we've baked out. So I'm going to just adjust this to make it look a little bit better. Maybe a little bit like this. And I think the dirt is pretty bright, so I'm going to just add a filter. Go to Edit Material, Filters, and add a new filter. And just add HSV. And I'm just going to turn down the value of this. So it's like maybe black dirt or something. Or just very, very faint dirt. So we don't quite remove that nice bluish sort of look we're getting from the rock. The last thing we're going to cover in the basic tutorial is decal layers. So if I add a new layer and I add a decal, when you add a decal layer, they work slightly differently from other layers. You can't really change the projection of these because it's actually using the projection of this empty object to project textures. And when you create one, you shouldn't get a texture initially, so this texture slot is empty. And I'm going to import this decal. In this case, I've got a Blender logo, so I'll import this. And when you create a decal layer, if you go to the Edit Mask section, you're already given a image texture mask that comes with the decal layer. So if I select this Blender color, which is the texture that we just imported, now I should see a Blender logo appear, right? And an important thing to note about this mask is it's actually using the alpha channel of the texture that's in the texture slot to mask rather than the color. So if you want to change that, you can just click this here. I won't for this particular image because I do actually want to use the alpha to mask this out. However, adding this kind of like ruins the sort of flow we're getting on with like the gold and the bluish rock here. So I'm going to go back here. I'm going to change the texture set that we've got here to the gold again. Let's import this. So now I have this sort of gold Blender logo. And I want to reposition this onto the object. So I'm going to grab this and move it. And you'll note it moves with the object, but there's an issue here. It's like it's hard to position it where you want it on the object, right? So that's where this decal snapping comes in. So if you select the object, select a decal layer, there's a layer utility function called set decal snapping. So if you turn that on, it will just adjust some of your snapping settings to be sort of optimal for moving these decals around. So if you click this and you hold G to move it, you can now move the decal significantly easier around on your model. So if I just position it maybe like right there on his head, because that's kind of cool. There we are. Now we got a pretty pimped out looking monkey there. All right, so lastly, we'll want to bake these textures out. So that way, rather than having them stored in these really complicated layers that are really tough for the computer to render, they're just baked down to a single texture set that we can use for importing this model into a game engine or a different Blender scene or something like that. So we'll go to the Export tab, and you'll just want to check on the texture sets that you want to export. So if for whatever reason you don't want metallic or you don't want roughness, just check them off. And then click Batch Export while you're selecting your object. And again, it'll just start exporting these. So if we go to the place where you've saved your Blender file, it should create a folder called textures for you. And then in there, as it renders these out and bakes them down to textures, these materials will be, or sorry, these textures will be saved to this folder for you automatically. So there's the color, we've got metallic, there's roughness, and let's give it a moment for the normals. And there we go. So it's the color channel, and you see the colors baked pretty well, even including the decal. Metallic looks pretty solid. There's the normal map and roughness. All right, in the export texture name settings, I just also have a texture format which I've added. Standard is just using the object name and material name, but there's also one for Unreal Engine and Unity. And this just follows the suggested naming convention for Unreal Engine and Unity, so the T object name and then the abbreviation for it. So if you're exporting to those, it may help to just change the texture format name. All right, so that's where the basic tutorial in terms of workflow ends, but there's actually a little bit of a bonus. I just want to talk about how Matlay actually works in the background for those who are interested. If you go to the shading tab and you select the object that we were working on, and you go to the material, I can just get control space to make this a little bit bigger. You can see what it's actually done for you in the background, where it's created all these nodes for you and linked them automatically when you started creating and editing using the add-on interface. So you have one group node per material channel, and inside these group nodes, if I push tab to go into them, I can see all of the nodes that it's created for these different layers. So you got your rock, you got your gold, gold 2, ground, and then this decal. And you see this is actually fairly complicated. It probably would have taken you a while to actually connect by yourself. I'd also like to point out that these are not intended to be edited in any way manually, right? So all editing should be done through the material interface in the add-on, and you shouldn't go in and start moving these nodes around or renaming the nodes. Otherwise, you'll run into a whole bunch of issues using the add-on in the future. You got to keep these nodes in the correct format with the correct names because the add-on relies on that. This is just sort of showcasing a lot of the hard work that the add-on is doing for you in the background. It's just reconnecting these nodes automatically for you. So that's the tutorial for using Matlay. I really hope you have a lot of fun using this add-on. I had a ton of fun making it, and I do plan on adding new features and fixing bugs and stuff with Matlay as they occur in the future. So that's it, that's all, and take care.